So, welcome to our special Texas Tech Climate Center event that we're calling Inside COP30 Science Solutions in the Texas Tech Perspective. We've got a great group of panelists here to talk to you all about COP30 that just recently happened. I'll introduce them in a second, but just to start, COP30, as you probably know, was the 30th session of the United Nations Climate Change Conference. So the first one was held in 1995. This is 30 years later, and the 30th one. It was held in Belém, Brazil, at the Hangar Convention Center, and revolved around negotiations between the participating countries on phasing out fossil fuels. And so there were 56,118 delegates, according to the number that I found, from 194 countries that attended COP30. As you may know, the United States did not officially participate, but we did have some folks from Texas Tech here that did attend, that you'll get to meet here in a second. Just some quick recaps. Some of the agreements that came out of COP30 included tripling funds for climate adaptation in the next 10 years, so by 2035, using a just transition mechanism to support a movement to a more green economy or totally green economy, potentially. And then the adoption of 59 indicators to track adaptation progress. And so Tech sent three people to COP30 who are all with us here today. Bryan Giemza, Ting Lin, and Sophia Rodriguez. Um, so they went to COP30 with some support from the T2 Climate Center, as well as our former Climate Center director, Katharine Hayhoe, who's also here with us and closely followed the conference and has attended past conferences as well. So today's event is going to focus on their experiences. So what was it like to be there? What was it like to follow along with COP30? Um, and we would like, so I've got some questions and prompts for our panelists, but we would like to make this as interactive as possible. So we'll be using Poll Everywhere for question and answer. Mackenzie will be dropping a link to that Poll Everywhere in the chat. You're also welcome to, so with Poll Everywhere, you can ask a question directly, but you can also upvote the questions that you like the best, and those will bring them to our attention, and we'll be more likely to get to those upvoted or heavily upvoted questions. You can also enter your questions into the Zoom chat if that's easier for you. We'll also be monitoring the Zoom, and you can give thumbs up and things to questions you like there too, and we'll try to get to the most popular ones. Okay, so on to our panelists. The first introduction is Bryan Giemza, who's a professor of humanities and literature in the Honors College. He's a provost fellow for outreach and engagement. He's written a large number of books and articles on technology, communication, and misinformation, including the intersection with climate change. Our second panelist is Ting Lin, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Construction Engineering. Her research focuses on performance-based engineering, earthquake science, and climate change mitigation and adaptation, including multi-hazards, risks, and uncertainty. Our third panelist also attended COP30. She is Sophia Rodriguez, an undergraduate student in the Plant and Soil Sciences Department in the Davis College. Our fourth panelist is Katharine Hayhoe, who's an atmospheric scientist and chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, as well as a Horn professor and political science endowed chair in public policy and public law in the Department of Political Science here at Tech. She's written a ton of articles and books on climate science, as well as science communication and climate change communication, and received a large number of awards and honors for her work. Please welcome our panelists, and I'll kick it off with the first question to Katharine. So the question is, what are these COPs? Why do they matter, and what goes on at these meetings?
Well, that's a very good question to start with, Nick, because COP is an acronym. It stands for Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is a mouthful. So, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed by every country in the world, including the United States, in 1992 in Rio, Brazil. So, it's sort of symbolic that it came back after 30 years to the same country. And in that agreement, all the countries in the world agreed to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system, especially that would affect food, water, health, infrastructure, and all of the things that climate change is affecting today. So then all the countries in the world got together at the first conference of parties 3 years later, and now we've gotten to the point where we have one every year. And the point of these conference of parties is not for scientists or researchers to go and talk about climate change. The point is for negotiators for every country that signed the framework to come together and negotiate what they're going to do together. And it took quite a long time, but 10 years ago in Paris in 2015, all of the countries in the world signed the Paris Agreement, which was the largest global treaty on anything ever signed. And it just so happened to be on climate change because it's a global issue. So since then, these meetings have focused on the different countries negotiating with each other to figure out how they're going to actually meet the Paris targets. So when these meetings first started, they were only attended by government representatives. So the first few COPs were very small. They were held in Bonn, Germany, and they just had negotiators and a small team from each country. But over time, they've gotten bigger and bigger. And now there's many representatives from universities across the world, from all kinds of nonprofits and organizations and for-profits. And in fact, at this COP, there were more delegates sponsored by the fossil fuel industry than any country delegation other than Brazil. So these days, there's tens of thousands of people who attend for all different reasons. There's booths for every country, there's booths for many different organizations. There's so much going on. You could spend a year there and not see it all, but it still has at the core those negotiations between countries.
Great. Thanks. Okay, so now we know a little bit about what these meetings are about. Now I want to know, what was it like to be there? So I'm gonna pose this question to Bryan first. What was it like to attend? What were your impressions of COP30?
Well, thank you, Nick, for the question. And I guess I need to start by saying attending felt like it was on a wing and a prayer from the very beginning. Katharine wrote some great posts about all the logistical and other difficulties that faced attendees this year. And to be honest, it was a notably expensive conference. It was difficult to get there. So I think I have to start with a word of gratitude. Were it not for Katharine opening a way for the Climate Center, for Ting somehow figuring out these incredibly complex logistics at the 11th hour, I wouldn't have been able to attend. But I keep that in mind because there are very many deserving people who probably couldn't be there. And as Katharine said, it is a vast and sprawling conference at this point. It's a kind of mini city of a conference. So what it feels like to attend for a newbie like me was learning to navigate a small city. It took several days just to figure out the ins and outs, the different status of people attending. In my case, as an observer on behalf of the Texas Tech system and academic observer, it is really a dazzling thing. And I would say it sort of fits our times, the best of times, the worst of times. At times, it felt like a bonfire of vanities. At other times, I saw some of the very best of humanity on display. And that was very inspiring, especially since people came from all over the world. And given the particular place and moment where the conference was held this year.
Thanks. Ting, do you have anything to add on your impressions?
Yeah, so I echo with Bryan, also in terms of gratitude, thanks so much to Karen, Nick, Natasha, and everybody here for your support. And we're just there presenting our university system. And it's just a lot of positivity from my end. I felt like it's radiating from the heart of the Amazon because there are so many people there in action, both inside and outside the venue. So it's huge, like what Brian described. There is the blue zone, which is the official one that require a badge to go in. And there is the green zone that's open to the local community. So you see lines like zigzags of people lining up to get in there. And there are also venues outside too, even in downtown, in the near the water. There are films and there are some actions also outside the venue, like action house or some others. So just lots of things going on.
Great. Well, the next question I have is for Sophia. Sophia, you're an undergraduate student. What was it like to attend a meeting like this, and what were your most lasting images and takeaways? I can unmute you if you can't unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, we got it. We
There
got
we
it.
go. Okay.
Yes. First of all, I want to echo what Dr. Giemza and everyone else has said of feeling just absolutely so grateful to be able to attend COP30. I think it's such a insane opportunity as an undergrad to be able to attend something like this. And I think that's something I definitely kept in mind while attending. I was just like a little sponge and I wanted to see as many panels as I could, listen and just hear what the locals had to say, hear what different NGOs had to say, meet as many people as possible. I think some of my biggest takeaways were definitely the fact that there's so many people there and you can find someone who aligns with your area of expertise or your area of interest and really like build connections that are just so valuable at like something so big like COP30 that has that kind of international scale. It's just beyond. And then also I would say it kind of put things into perspective for me. I think like being able to hear from different perspectives and everyone kind of comes in with different cultural experiences, different value systems. And I think coming to terms with the fact that sometimes they clash and sometimes people come in with different perspectives and it kind of makes for a challenging negotiation sometimes with something that I really took away from the experience. And it was just, among other things, those were kind of the big things that I took away.
Great. Thanks. Well, I've got a follow-up question for the three of you all that came in from the poll everywhere. And should have asked it myself. But somebody asked, what was your role as attendees at the conference? And were you able to contribute in any way? And if so, how did you contribute? Oh, and y'all are
I will, I guess, start us off there. As observers, as I see it, that is our official designation. And you have people with badges of all different colors. The people who Katharine referred to earlier, who are huddling together and in some of the more fraught negotiations, working things out. They're the parties in the conference of parties. We had observer status, and we were able to, in some cases, sit in on those meetings, but not all of them. Some are open, some are closed, some are kind of hybrid. And all of that eventually gets channeled into these high-level plenaries and other discussions. But to the point that Sophia made, some of the more interesting moments occur in those glimpses where you see where sausage is being made. And as the political process unfolds, we witnessed a really interesting session like that, where there was something akin to some actual arm twisting going on, or at least a very intense human huddle. as parties attempted to persuade another party to get on with things, basically. So that was fascinating. But we were just sitting there observing, often interacting with experts. And there's a whole branch of this activity, as Ting was saying, that goes to these incredible pavilions and ongoing rolling presentations with experts from around the world. So when you sort of got tired of the politicking, you could actually duck into those and learn a great deal on site. And this is before we even get to other areas of the conference that were more like, how to describe it, a giant trade show of sorts. So,
Yeah.
but maybe Sophia or Ting wants to speak to that in a little more detail, or the huddle that we saw, Sophia, in that one session where you were observing.
Yeah, I think as an observer, it is a lot of just listening and learning. Like that's one thing I took away the most, and like witnessing these kind of negotiations, you really learn about like how these people speak about certain things and kind of the diplomatic talk of it all. I think it's just super cool to be in a space like that and be able to kind of see how these kinds of political conversations happen in real time. And so, yeah, I think for me, at least what like an observer meant was just kind of sitting there and yeah, like what Dr. Giemza was saying about attending different panels and like there's so many different kind of panels going on, whether it's about like more agriculture focused or there's some about culture and like education. There's like so many different things you can go and listen to. And I think that's also super cool because you can kind of pop in and out of different things. If there's a speaker that you really kind of admired or want to talk to more, you can go after and connect with them. So I think it was definitely a lot of connecting, learning, listening, and yeah.
I think so. I wasn't there this year, but having attended previous years, I think one of the things that sort of surprised me, this is going to sound silly, but I'm sort of hearing that from what you were saying too, Sophia and Bryan, is um, these everybody are just people. Like the negotiators are just people. So they get upset, they bring their own biases to the table, they misunderstand things. And so we often don't think about the fact that these global negotiations are being conducted by individual people just like us. Um, and it's really like such a weight of responsibility to be doing something like that on behalf of an entire country and on the world too. So no wonder it's so stressful. And I remember being at a COP before, there were these two Buddhist monks who were attending, and what they would do is they didn't really know. This is the first year they had done this. They didn't really know what to do. So they just decided to walk around. And obviously, Buddhist monks are wearing the whole Buddhist monk outfit, right? So everybody knew who they were. And so they just decided to walk around. And they said that wherever they went, within minutes, somebody would come up to them who was distressed, overwrought, panicked, like just having this complete emotional overwhelm because of the intensity of the negotiations. And so they said they would just like sit with them and do breathing exercises and help them calm down. And that human dimension of it, I just don't think that we think about until we're actually there seeing people in real life.
Absolutely. I think that's totally something that I witnessed. I was like, man, there's one person and they're kind of have this huge responsibility to represent an entire country. And I think it really kind of grounds things. And it's like these are people too, and they have their own perspectives, values, cultures, and those are things that come into play when these negotiations happen.
Yeah, I echo that too. My first COP was 16 years ago, COP15 in 2009, when I went with Stanford professor Steve Schneider and Terry Root. And I remember also the negotiation just went on and on, even longer, I think, than this time around. So it's like 50, 60 hours straight, right? So just kind of think about the stamina of those negotiators, right? Like representing their countries. And also when the fire broke out this time around, the second week or so, or the protest went to the first week, just think about all of those people. We are basically colleagues on the same UN bus. And in terms of roles. So I also kind of went to some of the events that Bryan, Sophia, and Katharine mentioned. And in addition, I also had the precious opportunity to give a keynote on global sea level rise model from mitigation to adaptation at UN Global Compact Network Brazil. So kind of again a very different audience there. So more on the private sector, CEOs, investors, and at the same time, just because I kind of didn't know that I was going to this COP30, so I agreed previously to World Meteorological Organization (WMO) to give a regional webinar. So right after I gave the keynote, I went backstage and then gave supposedly the region for the Americas and the Caribbean. But turns out 50 countries show up to that one. So to scientists again, so very, very different audience, scientists, parties, observers, public, private sectors.
Well, Ting, it's a great transition into the next question that I wanted to ask you, actually, because this is just from me reading the reports a little bit, but also something you mentioned earlier, that there seems to be this shift on moving from mitigation to adaptation. Um, uh, and I was hoping maybe you could discuss a little bit about what the difference between mitigation and adaptation are, and whether you felt like there was an emphasis on sort of shifting from one to the other, and what you think that means, and maybe how it entered the conversations and negotiations at COP30.
Okay, a series of great questions right there. So mitigation, adaptation, maybe in the case of sea level rise, we can think about it. So the cause of it and then the impact. And same thing with climate change. So essentially what causes climate change, right? And then what is the impact of climate change? So if you are adjusting the cause of it, it's more in the mitigation side of it. So emission reduction, for instance. If you are adjusting more on the impact side, then it's more adaptation. So that's in short kind of what it is. And then there is also a mixture. Also, sometimes it's not necessarily from one to another, but I would rather say in parallel. It's just a percentage shift, right? And then sometimes also there are cases where you can generate co-benefits for both of them together. Mangrove, for example, is an example of maybe both the mitigation and adaptation case. And then in terms of focus for COP30 on the adaptation. Part of it is also because all the extreme events are already happening. So, for instance, like COP15, back then in Copenhagen, we call it Copenhagen. It was all pretty much all about mitigation because I remember I was being the odd one. I was the only civil structural engineer among a group of climate scientists back then. And so it was all about emission reduction, mostly. And then now, because it's no longer just the polar region that's happening. The polar ice melting is already causing sea level rising everywhere else. So compound that with some of the extreme events too is basically amplifying a lot of those in terms of multi-hazards. So that's why also a lot of the countries are already experiencing that. That's why some of the discussion now focus on resilience, focus on loss and damage, and also along with the finance, because they also recognize the global lack of funds in terms of adaptation. And part of the effort is also not just at UNFCCC. In fact, I went to several other UN meetings. Earlier this year, I spoke at the UN Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDR, Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. So that is more focusing on the Sendai framework. And along with this, essentially coming hand in hand, thinking about both climate mitigation, adaptation, and also disaster risk reduction. So there are a lot of global efforts going on. And in terms of how that entered the negotiation, so a lot of this, for instance, this is a global assessment report on disaster risk reduction. So it says resilience, pace, financing, and investing for future, summary for policymakers. And then, I guess it's discipline. And it's available in all 6 official UN languages, as well as its full version report. So some of the policymakers will pick up copies like this at various meetings, and then that may or may not impact their negotiations.
And I would say too, Ting, you're perfectly right. 15 years ago, we weren't seeing the impacts of climate change unless we lived, you know, at the pole or on a low-lying island. Today, we're seeing those impacts, and most countries in the world have contributed almost nothing to this problem, yet they're bearing the brunt of the impacts. So a lot of the discussions about adaptation are related to what there is called the loss and damage. So loss and damage is the idea that all of these countries that didn't produce a lot of heat trapping gases are actually experiencing massive disproportionate loss and damage, and they need to be compensated for that loss and damage by the countries that produce the emissions to grow their economy but aren't suffering the impacts. So that's why adaptation has also entered the discussion, is because it's an issue of justice and equity, in that those who are bearing the brunt of the impacts are not the people who made the decisions to cause the problem in the first place. This is true across countries. It's true across socioeconomic strata. Rich people have much higher footprints than poorer people, yet poorer people are more vulnerable to the impacts. And it's also true across ages. The babies being born today will be bearing the brunt of the impacts over their lifetime, yet they played no role whatsoever in causing the problem that has occurred primarily during our lifetime. I mean, since I was born, 70% of our carbon emissions have been produced only since I was born, because the growth since the beginning of the industrial era is exponential. So that's why we talk a lot about adaptation, but we have to talk about mitigation too, because if we don't mitigate, we won't be able to adapt. It's not either or. It's like we have to do as much as possible of both of them to be as better off, as best off as we can.
Well, and that was going to be a little bit of my follow-up there was, did you feel like adaptation was coming to the forefront at the expense of mitigation? Or was it just that mitigation is still just as important as it ever was, but adaptation is this really pressing issue for lots of people around the world and becoming exponentially more pressing? Anybody have a feeling on that? Because reading the reports myself as an outsider, I wasn't able to get a good sense of that.
I guess it's again going hand kind of like in twins or in parallel.
Okay.
So some of this also, I think the mitigation is going to, no matter what is going on with adaptation, mitigation is going to happen. And it's going to happen also regardless of the negotiation outcomes, because a lot of the actions are local.
Yeah.
And also economics driven.
Sure.
And then adaptation, on the other hand, is sort of like maybe slowly waking up, like or a baby. Maybe it was a baby 16 years ago. Now the baby is growing up. So now we get to know him or her a little bit more, and then now we pay more attention to it, and then also sort of urgency as well. Because for some of this is like near term, it's not like this long term like countries being raised in long term no longer exist, but some of this is short term, like it's already happening. So part of the short term multi-hazard long term existential threat. So it's really drawing a lot of attention. And like what Katharine mentioned earlier on, also is a matter of justice. In fact, the International Court of Justice, right, kind of rule on that also in terms of the importance of this loss and damage. And this summer, I met the Minister of Vanuatu in Geneva, Switzerland, and he's pointing at sea level rise and say, zoom in to this map. I said, why? He said, oh, right there. This is where our church is located. Now it's going into water.
Well, I actually think this is a good transition into the next question I had. This meeting was held in Brazil, right? It was just part of the Global South and home to one of the largest, if not the largest, sink for carbon emissions, the Amazon rainforest. The question here is a little bit about adaptation and mitigation, but also a little bit about justice too. To Bryan, how are the perspectives of Brazil, but the Global South more broadly, represented at the conference? Was there more of an emphasis because of the location, you feel like, this year, or?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the way that we often know institutions by their origins. And I love the way that even in our even in our time, there's a way in which place can really inform a gathering. And we saw that over and over again. For me, this was particularly exciting because my research area is in climate communication, misinformation in a global South context. Not only that, but I will lead with some good news. There was a very significant development in terms of what we sometimes call information integrity, and some nations signing on to take a robust position in terms of having better climate communication, better climate information. I'm going to put two links into the chat that are relevant to this. One is about that first time that information integrity was formally promoted in the discussions. So for my research, that was a breakthrough. But my research is increasingly looking at information integrity in the global South. And as it happens, many of the tactics that are used to sow doubt and confusion and misinformation around climate change have also been exported to the global South. So I was watching everything that was going on with very keen interest. One other bit of good news, interesting development that way, that's been in the news this week, in fact, is a lawsuit which was brought on behalf of plaintiffs in Africa responding to greenwashing from oil and gas in various settings in Africa. So this kind of goes along with this idea that the global South is recognizing the importance of information integrity and taking a stand. Now, I led, like Katharine always does, with the good news. The not so good news, one of the enduring images of the conference was something that Sophia saw, which was an Indigenous woman who was just crying softly over by the bathrooms after another round of failed negotiations. We saw all kinds of amazing and powerful things play out at the conference. But that image haunts me because the kinds of things that we're talking about from the standpoint of global North perspective of affluent countries, a lot of climate harms are still, to some people, somewhat abstract, somewhat distant. No matter how keenly we might perceive or feel them, they still seem, well, okay, that's not, for example, if we have a big hurricane, okay, well, we can rebuild, we have insurance. What was very apparent among the Indigenous and global South populations, and they made this felt, was that the harms are real, they're acute, they come at the cost of human life and well-being, and they're being felt in the here and now. So it was quite heart-wrenching, to be honest, to see how their concerns were often overridden in the political process. We got an interesting glimpse at the end of the conference. There was an astonishing moment in that final plenary in which the Colombian Minister for the Environment responded to Russia in very patronizing and high-handed terms, saying, we're not interested in these global South countries who are banding together to demand a roadmap to a transition away from fossil fuels. And I would encourage everyone to check that out if you have a chance. It was incredibly powerful. But another powerful moment that we were lucky to bear witness to was the signing of a land agreement, or rather a funding agreement for the preservation of part of the Amazon. Now, in the same week, the news broke that, this painting had sold at auction for a record high bid of almost $250 million. we were there to see the indigenous activists and other parties to the signing, celebrating the fact that over $1 billion had been earmarked to preserve the Amazon. Again, you take the good news where you can, but I also find it quite heartbreaking to consider in a world of billionaires, perhaps soon we'll have a trillionaire, that we struggle to find these resources for even this much. Elsewhere, we attended panels where we saw, for example, how, and this is important to understand, we can preserve the Amazon, we can try to preserve these lands, but if the whole ecosystem is threatened by climate change, you still get die-offs. We went to interesting scientific panels on this. We attended one from a guide who was involved in a lawsuit against a German company that was polluting because he was a guide who works in a glaciated area in South America. And so on and on, we saw these evidences brought out in very powerful ways. And we also experienced, I think, the incredible warmth of some of the indigenous people that we encountered in various contexts at the conference. Some we had never met before, but there was a sense of instant familiarity. I put in the comments a Guardian article. The Guardian has brilliant coverage of the Conference of Parties, but I especially love this one because it was written from an indigenous perspective by an indigenous journalist and experiences at the conference. And every line of it resonated with me. I thought, how can people get good things done in the midst of this chaos, in this hurly-burly? But they do. And actually, just reading that made me feel so much better about the often sort of confounding experience of being in this place. And at once inside, you often feel inside and then completely outside at the same time. How much more so the people who came to this conference and the indigenous people, many of whom this was a thing. You have to remember in Brazil that you have some of the highest rates of, frankly, I mean, how else can you say, murder, homicide of indigenous people protecting their own lands when there are conflicts with, shall we say, moneyed interests. It often results in death, and they lead the world on that count. So you have this other problem of Brazil, according to some accounts, let's just say not handling very gracefully the inclusion of these indigenous community members. And you have all of the cultural disconnects that come with that. It's hard enough for anyone to navigate this bewildering conference. But if you're coming from a remote area and you have a completely different set of cultural codes, you can imagine the kinds of things and misunderstandings that can breed. So it was very complex, and we were reminded constantly of the realities of the indigenous presence and the global South presence at the conference. Sorry, that's a very long answer, but there's so much that was powerful that we experienced there.
Thanks, Bryan. I've got a bit of a follow-up for Ting that is something you mentioned to me after you got back, and I would like you to expand upon it. You noted the shift from artificial intelligence, which may offer some solutions, but definitely come at a high cost of emissions, to ancestral intelligence. So artificial intelligence to ancestral intelligence. And so I kind of want to know, what do you mean by that? And sort of how did you see that play out in the conference, and how do you see that sort of ancestral intelligence being a tool that can help us mitigate and adapt to climate change? We have to unmute you again. Sorry, team. Here we go. Here we go.
Hello?
There we go. Good.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of a new AI that I learned from this conference. Because I'm sure everybody else is familiar with the other AI, artificial intelligence. And on one hand, they kind of, like you mentioned a lot of emission maybe on that end. And on the other hand, it also helps some of the weather forecasts, for instance, flooding forecast from that end. So AI, you can use AI for good also. In fact, there is a global summit on AI for good this summer also organized by ITU, International Telecommunication Union in Geneva as well. But on the other hand, advanced technologies, we can rely on it to help improve life, to make things better, stronger. But at the same time, I was super humbled by an outside event. It's a climate action house. So outside the venue, and there they invited indigenous people, the defenders. They call themselves the defenders of the forest. So essentially, they mentioned, "Oh, you're all talking about all this exciting technology, this and that, but something I think." And that's when the term ancestral intelligence was brought up. And I thought it was really a moment that really being humbled by people who are already there for generations. They probably know best from indigenous knowledge in terms of how they defend their forests, right? Like protect it and preserve it, and also how they adapt in terms of harsh conditions. So perhaps we can listen more to those people, listen to the local voices. And in fact, there is also a very touching image that emerged from the conference. So when I went for the first week, and then Bryan and Sophia went for the second week, the first week we got a protest on the venue that's blocking the entrance of the blue zone.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened though is the COP president actually went ahead and then talked to the people. And he's even holding a baby, an indigenous baby. And so it's really an image that's really touching. It's sort of like, what if we can all listen more and care more? The world will be a better place.
I totally agree. The I want to continue on the same sort of theme about kind of people and the sort of humanistic aspect of these sort of negotiations. And Sophia, if you're okay with it, I want to actually pose this question to you. So, right, these negotiations are ultimately about people, and they take place, amongst people from different countries, but also with different experiences and different values, right? Um, so, as an observer, how did you kind of see that human element play out in these negotiations, and sort of if you could touch on the humanistic or any sort of spiritual type aspects, indigenous aspects of these negotiations.
Yeah, for sure. I think Dr. Giemza and Dr. Lin also touched on this, but I do think that the indigenous presence there brought um, a sense of connection. Like I think a lot of people were able to feel more connected to the place that we were at, right? Like we're in the Amazon, and I think having those perspectives and those people there kind of brought that energy into the conference. And I could feel it, you could feel it in the air, and just like there's like a positivity, there's like a passion there that I think these indigenous representatives who came were able to kind of share with everyone else. And like Dr. Giemza said, I did unfortunately see an indigenous woman crying in the corner, and she was getting consoled by another lady. And I think those kinds of images and moments are kind of sprinkled throughout the conference, maybe not so negative, but there are moments with that you meet indigenous members and stuff like that. And I think it really it has this you just have this like it brings that human aspect like we're talking about, I think. And you can feel it in the negotiations when people are advocating for whether it's more funding or whatever, their own countries and stuff like that. I think the indigenous presence was definitely felt, and I think it was to our benefit. I think it brings things into perspective that there are people who are actively being affected by climate change and climate effects now, like right now as we're speaking. And yes, we're very privileged in the global north to maybe not put those pieces together quite yet, but the reality is that these people are being affected, and lives are lost, and ecosystems are being destroyed. And having those people there was a constant reminder of those things. And I think ultimately it was definitely to the benefit of the conference. And yeah, that's what I would add. I think the conference would not be the same without them, for sure.
Great, thanks. I've got a follow-up question that I'm going to try to summarize that came from the chat or from the poll everywhere. I'm not sure. But the question is really about who holds the power here in sort of these negotiations. So, there's an indigenous presence. There are these stewards of the land that are there arguing on their behalf. Uh, but the question is, is it the carbon market verifier, the national military, the agribusiness lobby, or the indigenous communities that really hold the power to decide on the change or not change? What we're going to do in the face of this crisis. Tough question, I know, but open to the floor if anybody's got a thought.
Well, I think there's a way in which power is distributed and being worked out in real time when you're in these settings. But I also, I have to say, I was brought back to an earlier time in my life with maybe it was a kind of clarity of vision or a pressing moral vision. Because the reality is, and this was brought forward again and again by especially women from the global south and indigenous communities. But these hierarchies are in your face, and in all our best human efforts to do what we can to bring representation, the entire sort of the mechanisms by which these things are translated into policies. They evince all of our human imperfections. And here's where I go back to a vision that I had when I was still a teenager. And maybe this is unflattering, but I find that there's a truth in it. The dress code for this conference, thank goodness, was actually informal. It was, I think, casual smart was the term of art. And that was so wonderful because it was incredibly hot where we were. 212 days a year of unhealthy heat, in fact, of dangerous heat. And we got a little taste of that. Another thing that fit this conference. But where I saw something interesting was in what you might call the suits. And this goes back to adolescent Bryan. But time and again, I watched as negotiations faltered as the suits arrived. And I know that sounds immature. It's like saying I'm blaming the man in capital letters, but I kid you not. There was virtually a dress code. You could watch this happening because the kinds of people, and unfortunately, this goes to another question that came up. The United States was, of course, not formally present. And our absence then puts us in some ways in a league with, say, Russia and Saudi Arabia and petrostates who were really obstructing certain types of political action. And it was not hard to see when the suits arrived. So I'm just saying this was very, on the one hand, I mean, maybe that sounds adolescent, but there was something very true in this. And I went, wow, okay, I can actually see what's happening in this very visible way at some of the negotiations. That says something about power and its raw operation. Also, the side conversations I caught where I could hear businessmen working out how they were going to, inform corporate boards of what was playing out. I also saw people, vying for alliances, and some
Mhm.
of those meetings fell flat.
Mhm.
Everywhere you went, if you were paying attention, you could see power operating at every level of this conference and working it out from high level to low level. That's why I say there is a way in which it's a bonfire of the vanities, but perhaps the best we can do as human beings to try to come to consensus.
Okay, I've got a question that came up from one of you all in the crowd that is much better than my last question, so I'm gonna replace it. Um, so I'll pose it to Catherine maybe first, but others please jump in. Do you think recent COPs have become more symbolic than substantive? It was mentioned that this current COP kind of seemed like had sort of a festival atmosphere or something maybe, and or as somebody put in the questions, maybe feels more like a trade expo than a real substantive negotiation space. And so, yeah, the question to you, Catherine, is do you feel like that's a real sentiment or yeah?
Well, that's a question that I've asked myself every time I've gone. And just to be clear, I've only gone 3 times myself out of 30. I think the answer to is it more symbolic than substantive is yes and no.
Okay.
I lean more on the yes side, but there's plenty of arguments to be made for no too. So I think the challenge is that the initial purpose of this whole thing was to have the country negotiators negotiating with each other. That is still extremely necessary. Why? Because this is a global treaty, and there's no way to enforce this other than basically peer pressure. That's about it. And so when all these countries get together, I often talk about COP like a global potluck. And all the countries get together, and it's really obvious that Costa Rica bought a fresh handmade mango flan to the table, and Russia dragged an old 30-year-old chicken nugget from the back of their freezer. And it's pretty embarrassing, speaking to people being involved in this, when you have to bring up the one chicken nugget on a giant platter and put it down in front of everybody else. And this other country that's like, a 30th your size has like a handmade dessert that everybody wants. So, from that perspective, it is actually very important because the negotiators are human to have humans looking at each other in the eyes when they're making these negotiations. Digital engagement allows us to dehumanize each other. And when you have somebody who represents a South Pacific island, that they're going to lose their entire island due to unchecked sea level rise if we don't do something about it. When they're looking into your face with tears in their eyes, telling you what's happening to their home and their family and their town, that is radically different than if you're just reading an article online. So, from that perspective, they are really substantive. And in fact, if you could just lock all these negotiators up together for a couple months, I think we'd get even more done. But the trade show around it, like I'm talking about everybody. There are heads of, the delegation from the Rotary Club is there. The delegation from the Church of England is there. The delegation from Amazon is there, or from IKEA. The delegation, as we heard it, from all the fossil fuel industries. So, and the delegations from all the universities too, including now ours. So, with all of these delegations, they are playing an important role in that they're talking to each other about collaborations, obviously with one notable exception. But having these conversations about collaborations is also very important. So honestly, if I were in charge, this is what I would do. I would separate the two. I would say that all the negotiators go to Bonn, where you have the facilities, you've always had them, you do the negotiations, and then the trade show can tour the world, not in remote locations where it takes 25 hours to get there and costs huge amounts of money, but centrally located locations where it's very easy to get there. It's very easy to host large numbers of people, and you bring everybody together. In fact, what I would do is I would actually take the trade show, so to speak, and I would make it regional. I would have one for Southeast Asia, one for Africa, one for Latin America, one for North America. You could even have one for all the Americas one year. Because when we start to talk about solutions, Ting, you said this earlier, most solutions are not happening at the national scale. Most solutions need to be implemented at the scale of cities, organizations, or regions. So where we really need the discussions and collaborative engagement that this type of event fosters is at the regional scale. So if we kept on with the negotiations, but invested even further in bringing people together to talk about solutions on a regional scale, I think that would be much more effective, as well as having a lower carbon footprint.
Yeah, totally agree. So national, state, city, local, right? All those levels. And in fact, contrary to kind of the power, I think also the other side of it is the powerless. Like what Katharine mentioned also, I actually, as an observer, I went to some of the events and I asked the small island developing states what's facing them in terms of sea level rise challenges. And indeed, that moment came. I was crying. I was listening to all their stories. And they were also so touched. It's like a mutual communication. They were saying, oh, please, please keep working on your global sea level rise model. We need it. So those kind of interaction really make a difference.
Yeah, I guess I could see the benefit of what you're saying, Catherine, but also sort of the downside of, separating the suits from the non-suits, kind of getting back to what Bryan was saying, and sort of how powerful, hopefully, it can be to, have some of people that maybe don't have the purse strings, but are being most affected by this global crisis, being in the same room with the people that are least affected and have the purse strings. And so it's a hard challenge to try and get all of those perspectives together and then also have these substantive negotiations happen on top of that. All right. Well, panelists, does anybody else have any last words?
Does everybody want to pick one question from it? Because we have a lot of great questions and give like a 2-sentence answer to them. I'll go first. And everybody else, you look and pick your question and 2-sentence answer. All right. So let's see. Doesn't seem the science is getting the proper respect and driving the negotiations. So the science used in the negotiations are the IPCC reports. That is why the IPCC reports exist. They are the basis for the negotiations. So is the science informing the negotiations? Yes. Is it getting the proper respect? No, because the science says that the more action we take and the faster we do it, the better off we'll be. And that is not the direction the negotiations are going in. Who's next?
I can go. So there is a question regarding early warning systems, whether it will be easy to understand and accessible for all at very local level. And so for that effort, there is actually an early warning for all initiative from WMO, World Meteorological Organization, and also UNDRR. So that's already being kind of accessible to a lot of countries. And then they are hoping to do more and more of those as well. So essentially, again, from the region, and that's why some of those regional themes like Katharine was mentioning is so powerful because then you can all share success stories and what worked, what doesn't. Yeah.
Exactly. That's an example of how people are getting to get together at these meetings to do more. All right. Sophia, do you have a question?
Yes, someone very kindly posed me a question in the chat, asking if, as a student, this experience influenced or changed any ideas about my future or career or health or well-being, any sorts of things like that. Thank you for whoever posed that question. And I think something that I really did take away that it was like a common theme in these panels was this breaking of silos and like interdisciplinary view on a lot of these issues. And that is something that I've definitely taken to heart and something that I plan to kind of use to inform my future research or future career in some sort of way. I think breaking these silos and kind of looking at these things from a larger perspective and putting these like multi-layered issues like with all of those layers is really important. And so I think in that way, career-wise, I think I've definitely taken that from it. And as well as like I met a lot of people my age there as well. There was some locals from Belém who I was able to talk to, and I think it was really nice to see a lot of youth there, and there's like a lot of hope and a lot of us kind of coming together with that same energy to kind of help mitigate climate in the future. And so that was really fun to see and connect with those people. So definitely overall, just like this interdisciplinary focus and the fact that there is youth fighting for climate, and that's awesome. And we need that. And there's a lot of us out here. So fingers crossed that we do some good work.
Bryan?
Well, that was a drop the mic moment. But I want to say, speaking of the clarity of youthful vision, time and again, I was always interested to hear what she had to say about what we had seen, because she would see right to the heart of it. And maybe that goes to one of the questions that came up in the chat, referring to how the conferences have turned towards and away from a path away from fossil fuels. And what does that say about the conference? It says something about the structural difficulty of the whole thing, which Katharine averted to earlier, where if a single party objects, then you have to have this consensus, and it's really hard to get. So what I would say is we listen to young people, we listen to indigenous voices. It's very clear that, and I think we have to be careful with science. The science is essential, but also we have to be humble and recognize that the global north has been happy seemingly to watch as the canoe goes over the falls in certain respects. Don't mean to, maybe I'm putting that too strongly, but what I mean is like I think we should be more attentive to voices from the global south as well, and this more distributed solution space. So I would say, Katharine, we need to, yes, put the negotiators in a room, maybe for 2 months, if that's what it takes. We had one session we watched where 80 hours of negotiation were tanked by one objecting party. So I say we put them in there for 2 months, we lock the doors, and maybe we only put 1 month of food in there, and then we see what happens. So anyhow, that's my concluding thought about that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much, panelists, for doing this, folks online for attending. One last thing to mention before I let you all go, to please check out the links in the chat for Katharine's newsletter, and how to follow and support the Climate Center. There's some good stuff there. So once again, thank you, panelists, so much. It was great to hear about your experiences. And thank you all for coming to listen. Have a good rest of your Monday evening. Bye, y'all.